Welcome to Decode Station. On this channel, we explore the business models, psychology, and systems behind some of the most fascinating companies and corporate stories in the world. Today, we're talking about the Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal.
This narrative is profoundly compelling because we are examining much more than a simple broken rule or a minor engineering oversight. When we analyze the sequence of events and the internal decisions made at Volkswagen, this story serves as a masterclass in the systemic failures of regulatory oversight.
You really are going to learn how an aggressive corporate strategy designed to dominate a foreign market led to a sophisticated engineering manipulation. This deliberate deception operated on an unprecedented global scale and successfully fooled regulators for years.
It is a perfect example of a historical scenario where the relentless pursuit of market dominance completely overpowered fundamental environmental accountability. It shows the dangerous consequences of poor corporate governance.
To understand the origins of this deception, we have to establish the narrative timeline starting in the early 2000s. During this period, Volkswagen formulated a massive corporate ambition to expand its market presence and increase sales in the United States.
That ambition presented a highly unique challenge for them. Historically, diesel passenger vehicles were deeply unpopular in the United States compared to their widespread acceptance throughout Europe.
American consumers primarily associated diesel fuel with loud, dirty commercial trucks. They simply did not view diesel as a viable option for everyday passenger cars.
That historical and cultural context is absolutely crucial for understanding the specific strategy Volkswagen developed to penetrate the American consumer market. To overcome this entrenched hesitation, the company engineered the Clean Diesel marketing campaign.
I find the psychology behind that campaign fascinating because they positioned their proprietary diesel technology as the ultimate automotive compromise.
They aggressively promoted the narrative that their modern diesel engines could meet the strictest environmental standards in the world. They claimed they can do this while simultaneously offering high performance and excellent fuel economy.
They were essentially attempting to convince the American public that a driver could possess the power and efficiency of a traditional diesel engine without contributing to the negative environmental impacts traditionally associated with that fuel type.
The strategy behind that marketing campaign is highly effective from a purely psychological and business perspective. They were selling a comprehensive solution to a problem that consumers previously thought was completely unsolvable.
By heavily emphasizing both fuel efficiency and lower carbon emissions in their advertising, Volkswagen successfully branded these vehicles. They framed them as a highly responsible choice for the environmentally conscious driver who still desired a powerful, engaging vehicle.
However, to fully grasp how this scandal actually materialized, we need to transition to the regulatory environment that governed these claims. We must understand the specific rules of the game that Volkswagen was legally obligated to play by in order to sell these passenger vehicles in the United States.
Let us break down those rules because automobiles sold in the United States must meet strict environmental regulations enforced by the Environmental Protection Agency, commonly referred to as the EPA. These rigid standards are specifically designed to limit the volume of harmful pollutants that internal combustion vehicles can release into the atmosphere.
One of the primary pollutants the EPA heavily regulates is nitrogen oxides, known scientifically as NOx. Controlling nitrogen oxide emissions is an exceptionally difficult engineering challenge for diesel engines, which inherently operate at much higher temperatures and internal pressures than traditional gasoline engines.
The stakes regarding the regulation of nitrogen oxides are incredibly high for public health. The EPA heavily regulates nitrogen oxides because this exhaust is not harmless vapor.
When nitrogen oxides react in the atmosphere, they create severe environmental hazards like dense smog and acid rain. Furthermore, elevated levels of nitrogen oxides are directly linked to severe respiratory issues in the population, including chronic asthma and other debilitating lung conditions.
Regulating these emissions is a matter of profound public safety, which brings us to the actual mechanism of how these regulations are enforced.
The regulatory system managed by the Environmental Protection Agency contained a critical structural vulnerability. The regulatory framework required manufacturers to test their vehicles exclusively in controlled laboratory environments.
The EPA relied heavily on these highly structured, standardized lab tests to determine if a specific vehicle model successfully met the mandated emissions limits.
Volkswagen consistently reported that its diesel vehicles passed these rigorous laboratory tests with flying colors. That official pass rate provided the legal foundation they needed to market these vehicles as low-emission alternatives to the American public.
The vulnerability in that testing procedure becomes clear when we analyze how a laboratory test actually operates. A vehicle undergoing an official emissions test is placed on a stationary testing rig known as a dynamometer.
The environmental temperature in the facility is perfectly controlled, and the steering wheel remains completely straight for the duration of the test.
The acceleration and deceleration of the vehicle follow a perfectly predictable, standardized pattern programmed by the regulators. It is a highly artificial scenario that does not replicate the unpredictable, chaotic nature of driving a vehicle on an actual highway or navigating through heavy city traffic.
That massive gap between a controlled laboratory environment and real-world driving created a specific vulnerability that could be exploited by sophisticated automotive engineering.
Modern vehicles are essentially rolling computer networks controlled by complex systems that monitor dozens of different sensors simultaneously. To bypass the environmental regulations, Volkswagen implemented a specialized piece of software programmed directly into the engine control unit of these vehicles.
This hidden software code eventually became known to the world as the defeat device. The mechanics of the defeat device are fascinating from a software engineering perspective.
The engine control unit had to be precisely programmed to recognize the highly specific artificial parameters of an EPA test.
The software continuously analyzed a variety of data points, tracking the exact position of the steering wheel, the duration of engine operation, the barometric pressure, and the vehicle's precise speed.
When the software detected that these incoming data streams perfectly matched the rigid conditions of an official laboratory emissions test, it triggered a hidden, programmed response within the engine.
Upon detecting those specific testing conditions, the defeat device software automatically activated a special operating mode. This mode deliberately restricted the engine's performance parameters to ensure that the combustion temperature was lowered.
Because the engine was running in this artificially restricted state, the emissions output was drastically reduced. This allowed the vehicle to easily meet the strict environmental limits for nitrogen oxides while secured inside the stationary laboratory.
The deception relied entirely on the software's ability to operate the engine differently when it knew it was being evaluated by government regulators.
The severity of the deception is fully realized when we examine the vehicle's behavior outside of the testing facility. During normal driving conditions on real public roads, the software completely switched this special emissions reducing mode off.
Because the restrictive system was deactivated during real-world driving, the engine operated at its full power capacity. Consequently, these vehicles pumped out significantly higher levels of nitrogen oxide than environmental regulations legally allowed.
You could purchase a car specifically because it was aggressively marketed as clean diesel, but every time you drove that vehicle, it was actively bypassing the environmental controls it utilized to pass the government certification test.
The regulatory agencies fully believed the stationary laboratory tests were sufficient proof of compliance. Volkswagen capitalized on this trust and continued to manufacture and sell millions of these vehicles based on those artificial laboratory results.
The true environmental impact of the vehicle was being deliberately hidden in plain sight, dispersed across global highways and urban centers. Maintaining an artificial system of this magnitude required a massive suppression of engineering data within the corporate hierarchy.
The unraveling of this global corporate secret did not initiate from a government regulator randomly auditing the software code. The discovery began with a small team of independent academic researchers at West Virginia University.
They designed an experiment to evaluate the emissions of these specific vehicles outside the pristine bubble of a government laboratory. Instead of relying on stationary dynamometers, the researchers focused entirely on measuring the exhaust output under actual dynamic driving conditions.
The methodology utilized by the West Virginia University researchers served as the primary catalyst that broke the massive scandal open. They secured a Volkswagen Passat and a Volkswagen Jetta and equipped them with portable emissions measurement systems.
This equipment is essentially a heavy, complex array of tubes, sensors, and exhaust analyzers. They securely strapped this large testing equipment directly into the trunk of the vehicles and connected the sensors to the exhaust pipes.
By removing the vehicles from the laboratory, the researchers fundamentally changed the variables of the environmental test. With the portable testing equipment actively recording data, the researchers drove these vehicles along Interstate 5 and navigated up the California coast.
They drove the cars through normal traffic congestion, accelerated up steep inclines, and maintained highway speeds. The findings from that real-world testing were absolutely staggering.
The recorded data proved that the specific Volkswagen vehicles produced nitrogen oxide levels up to 40 times higher than the legal limit permitted by environmental regulations. The emissions were drastically higher than the numbers Volkswagen had officially recorded in the lab.
That massive discrepancy provided the first concrete, undeniable evidence that the pristine laboratory tests were entirely disconnected from the mechanical reality of the vehicle's performance.
The independent researchers systematically documented their extensive findings and reported these alarming discrepancies directly to the Environmental Protection Agency and the California Air Resources Board.
These regulatory bodies immediately launched their own intensive technical investigations to understand exactly how a vehicle could legally pass a laboratory test but fail so spectacularly on the open road.
The culmination of these intensive regulatory investigations occurred in September 2015. The Environmental Protection Agency officially issued a formal notice directly accusing Volkswagen of installing illegal defeat devices in its diesel vehicles.
When regulators confronted the corporate executives with the undeniable software evidence extracted from their own engine control units, the company was trapped. Volkswagen had no alternative option but to formally admit guilt and confess that the defeat device software had indeed been deliberately installed in its vehicles.
The subsequent revelation regarding the sheer scale of the deception truly shocked the global business community. The company eventually confirmed that approximately 11 million vehicles worldwide were manufactured and equipped with this defeat device software.
Implementing a hidden software feature across 11 million individual vehicles requires a massive, highly coordinated engineering effort within the corporate structure. The discovery triggered an immediate and historic global crisis for the automotive manufacturer.
The financial markets reacted to the admission with extreme volatility. Volkswagen's share price plummeted, instantly erasing billions of dollars in market capitalization.
The corporation faced intense, immediate scrutiny from government prosecutors, environmental organizations, and millions of consumers worldwide. This immense pressure inevitably triggered a massive leadership crisis at the very top of the corporate hierarchy.
Shortly after the scandal became public knowledge, Volkswagen Chief Executive Officer Martin Winterkorn announced his immediate resignation. The individual who was directly steering the company during this aggressive international expansion strategy was forced to step down as the fundamental premise of their clean diesel narrative collapsed.
Winterkorn's exit statement remains a fascinating artifact of modern corporate crisis management. He publicly stated that he accepted overall responsibility for the irregularities found in the diesel engines.
However, he maintained that statement even as internal corporate investigations continued to uncover how the engineering manipulation actually occurred and who within the management structure explicitly authorized the deployment of the software.
The lack of clear, immediate accountability regarding who authorized the code highlights the profound failures in corporate governance that we established at the beginning of this deep dive.
It suggests the existence of a toxic, top-down corporate culture where failure to meet management targets was simply not tolerated. This intense internal pressure likely made the software engineers feel they had no choice but to implement a fraudulent solution, rather than admit to executives that they could not achieve both the performance goals and the environmental compliance targets simultaneously.
The fallout from this corporate culture failure severely damaged the financial stability of the corporation. When a global enterprise executes a deliberate deception of this magnitude, the financial penalty is monumental.
The regulatory framework, particularly in the United States, allows for massive punitive damages designed to punish corporate fraud. Volkswagen agreed to pay billions of dollars in direct fines to various environmental and government agencies.
Furthermore, the company was forced to fund massive legal settlements to compensate the angry consumers who had purchased vehicles based on entirely fraudulent marketing claims. The sheer logistics of resolving the crisis created an unprecedented operational nightmare for the company.
Volkswagen was mandated by regulators to institute massive vehicle buyback programs. We are talking about the global logistical challenge of locating millions of non-compliant vehicles, coordinated with thousands of independent dealerships, and repurchasing the cars directly from their owners.
For the vehicles that remained on the road, the company had to develop and implement complex engineering modifications that successfully removed the defeat device without completely ruining the vehicle's drivability and fuel economy.
The infrastructure required to manage a global recall of that magnitude is a massive enterprise in itself. When you aggregate the direct government fines, the consumer class action legal settlements, the unprecedented vehicle buyback programs, and the staggering logistical costs of the recall, The final financial impact is historic.
Total costs related to the Dieselgate scandal are estimated to exceed $30 billion. This overwhelming figure cements Dieselgate as one of the most expensive corporate scandals in the entire history of the automotive industry.
The legacy of Dieselgate extends far beyond a $30 billion penalty applied to a single corporation. This massive event fundamentally altered the global automotive landscape and reshaped the operational methods of regulatory bodies worldwide.
Regulators recognized that the structural vulnerability in their stationary testing system had been heavily exploited. Consequently, governments worldwide abandoned their exclusive reliance on pristine laboratory environments.
They permanently adopted comprehensive real-world driving emissions tests, effectively closing the loophole that allowed the defeat device to function undetected for years.
The operational shift in regulatory oversight was a significant consequence, but the most profound industry shift occurred within the automotive manufacturing sector itself. The public revelation of the scandal completely destroyed the viability of the clean diesel narrative.
This destruction served as a massive catalyst that accelerated the entire global industry's transition toward alternative powertrains. Manufacturers were forced to heavily pivot toward genuinely cleaner technologies.
Volkswagen and numerous major competitors began investing unprecedented amounts of capital into the research and development of electric vehicles to rebuild consumer trust and comply with the newly strengthened environmental regulations.
To summarize this deep dive for you, we have thoroughly explored a story of how a corporate desire to dominate the United States passenger market led to a sophisticated $30 billion deception.
By designing complex software that could recognize an emissions test and temporarily lower pollutants, Volkswagen managed to hide the true environmental impact of 11 million vehicles. The unraveling of that corporate secret, sparked by a small team of independent researchers strapping equipment to the trunk of a car, permanently destroyed the illusion of clean diesel and enforced a new era of global environmental accountability.
Before we conclude our analysis, I want to introduce a final thought for you to consider regarding the human element inside these massive corporate structures. Consider the individual software engineers who actually sat at their computers and wrote the code for the defeat device.
Did they view themselves as corporate criminals orchestrating a global environmental fraud, or were they simply employees solving a highly specific technical puzzle under the crushing pressure of a rigid, fear-based management hierarchy?
It begs a profound question about the systems we operate within. In a heavily siloed corporate structure, at what exact point does simply following a manager's orders cross the line into active participation in a global deception?
Stay curious, stay skeptical. See you in the next episode.